Our special guest today is Professor Supriya Chaudhuri. Good evening, Professor Chaudhuri.
Thank you. Good evening.
Yeah, and a very good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. Professor Chaudhuri, I'm certain, needs no introduction. Nevertheless, I'll stick to the tradition. Supriya Chaudhuri is Professor Emerita in the Department of English, Jadavpur University. Trained as an early modernist, she has written and published in the fields of Renaissance studies, critical theory, Indian cultural history, urban studies, sport, films, and modernism. Recent publications include Religion and the City in India, 2022, and Commodities and Culture in the Colonial World, 2018. Articles in Thesis 11, Postcolonial Studies and Spenser Studies, and chapters in The Form of Ideology and the Ideology of Form, 2022. Machiavelli Then and Now, History, Politics, Literature, 2022. Recycling Virginia Woolf in Contemporary Art and Literature, 2022. The Cambridge Companion to Rabindranath Tagore, 2020. And the Cambridge History of Travel Writing, 2019. She's active in debates on the humanities, gender, and intellectual liberty in India. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Chaudhuri, and to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Eliot's The Wasteland. Professor Chaudhuri has titled her talk Elliptic Epic, The Wasteland, 1922. And for the participants, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. They will be taken up towards the end of the session. Professor Chaudhuri, you can begin whenever you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dottu. I'd like to begin today by thanking Dr. Oshijit Dottu for inviting me to speak here at this series of talks celebrating 100 years since the modernist moment that is marked by the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in 1922. There is, of course, considerable irony in speaking of the centenary of a moment, which is otherwise a condensed, evanescent fraction of time. Just as it is ironic to speak of the modern as belonging to the past. And I will have reason to reflect on this irony with respect to the wasteland later in this discussion. In fact, Ulysses was published on the 2nd of February in that year, 1922, and The Wasteland in December, so that in February 2023, we are separated from the later date, the December date of The Wasteland, by almost exactly 100 years. Perhaps it's also worth remembering that Virginia Woolf also published a novel in 1922, Jacob's Room, and the English translations of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and the first volume of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past also appeared in 1922. Meanwhile, in 1921, Rabindranath Tagore had celebrated his 60th birthday in Germany's Weimar by visiting the Bauhaus, a center of modernist art practice led by Walter Gropius. As a result, a number of modernist works by painters like Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky were shipped out to India to be exhibited in Kolkata in December 1922, together with paintings by Gaganendranath and Abanindranath Tagore and their sister Shunayani Devi. These paintings by Klee and Kandinsky, by the way, were never returned to Weimar, so we don't really know what became of them. Somebody very lucky still has them in his collection in India, his or her. This inaugurated this event, the exhibition at the Society of Oriental Art, led by the Tagores in December 1922, inaugurated a new modernist movement in Indian art. And its first notable moments, of course, had taken place somewhat earlier in 1921, when a number of young Bengali men and women in Calcutta founded the Chatushkala Shomiti, or Four Arts Club, a venture that led directly to the publication of the modernist journal Kollo in 1923 and the commencement of what is known as the Kollol Jug in modern Bengali literature, also a marker of modernism in India. Now, if the happy coincidence of these and other such events constitutes the modernist moment around 1922, it's also worth remembering that it came at the close of one of the most devastating pandemics that the world had yet seen, the influenza epidemic of 1918 to 1919, which killed between 50 and 100 million people globally, around 2.5 million in Europe, and between 12 and 15 million in India, or 5% of the population. The French poet Guillaume Apollinaire and the Austrian artist Gustav Klimt both died in the influenza epidemic. T.S. Eliot feared that his brain had been damaged by his case of the flu, which occurred while he was revising The Waste Land. So think of him as suffering from COVID-19 while writing The Waste Land. And Virginia Woolf, initially skeptical of the impact of this disease, produced a profound set of reflections on being ill after having been in bed with influenza. In India, the Hindi poet Suryakant Tripathi, or Nirala, lost half his family, including his wife and daughter, to the epidemic in 1918. And the ravages of the disease are movingly described in the Bengali novelist Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel Shesh Prashno. So as we look back today at the modernist moment of 1922, so deeply implicated in the aftermath of a pandemic that Elizabeth Utka has termed it viral modernism, we might reflect on our own vantage point in 2023, following a global outbreak of an exactly similar kind. In crucial ways, I would like to suggest, modernism is related to catastrophe, melancholy, and loss. Its typical aesthetic forms manifest what Walter Benjamin called the facies hippocratica of history, the wasted and shrunken face that signals that the patient is approaching death. The title that I've given to my talk, Elliptic Epic, is a gesture towards something like this reading of modernist aesthetics. Perhaps I should start by trying to explain why I call this talk, why I refer to The Waste Land as an elliptic epic. Epic is the canonical literary form of Western civilization, occupying the highest place in an aesthetic hierarchy established from roughly the late Middle Ages. Loosely defined as a long poetic narrative about heroic actions on which the fates of nations or communities depend, it is characterized by an impulse towards totality, in that its extensiveness, its range, and its ambition endow it with a representative status. It becomes a culture or a society's image of itself. Critical moments of aesthetic history, when writers and artists urgently consult the ghosts of the past, and I'm deliberately using a phrase from Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the form of the epic is directly addressed as though a ghost from the past, as if to test its continued validity for an age that has chosen a different form of literary expression. This, for example, is what Wordsworth does in the Prelude. If you think of the opening lines of the Prelude, Wordsworth is clearly recalling Milton's Paradise Lost, or Fielding in Joseph Andrews or Tom Jones. By calling his book, his novel, a comic epic poem in prose, Fielding was anticipating the Hungarian critic George Lukács's proposition that the novel is a bourgeois epic. This is very famously put forward in Lukács's theory of the novel, but it's something that Fielding had already said by calling, in the preface to Joseph Andrews, calling the novel a comic epic poem in prose. Lukács says that the novel is a bourgeois epic, the epic of middle-class culture. Now, in some ways, the modernist movement, as Virginia Woolf described it, both in her essay on modern fiction and in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, is a reaction to and a rejection of the high bourgeois realist fiction that occupies the literary landscape of the 19th century, and that may be called the bourgeois epic. It was the realist novel that provided for the 19th century the most accessible means of epic totalization, though in a more democratic and generally accessible manner than we may assume classical epic to have done. In his great book, Mimesis, written as a wartime refugee in Istanbul, a book that attempted to recover and describe the literary forms through which Western culture had represented itself over many centuries, Erich Auerbach noted the bourgeois novel's impulse towards inclusiveness, detail, and breadth. In a remarkable essay that no one reads anymore, written by Aldous Huxley, Tragedy and the Whole Truth, Aldous Huxley argued that epic and novel alike have a generic predilection towards the whole truth, that is, the totality of lived experience, as opposed, Huxley said, to tragedy, which singles out only a critical, intensely felt aspect of the truth of life, the truth of existence. But by the close of the 19th century, and in the decades leading up to the Great War, the war in Europe, and the influenza epidemic, which followed immediately after the war in Europe, the weight, substantiality, and coherence of the material world, its narrative order, the kind of narrative order that had found a place in the high bourgeois novel, in realist fiction, the idea itself of wholeness and meaningfulness seemed to have dissolved or evaporated. As Marshall Berman put it, borrowing a phrase from Marx's Grundrisse, all that is solid melts into air. What I have described as the narrative confidence of bourgeois fiction is shaken by the incoherence of a world that has suffered repeated catastrophes and is only available for representation as a jumble of fragments, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, as Virginia Woolf called it. Now, whether for Virginia Woolf in modern fiction or for Robert Musil's hero Ulrich in The Man Without Qualities, the idea of a narrative order which has the look of necessity is already lost. Life has become non-narrative. That's what Ulrich says in The Man Without Qualities. In a famous passage, Robert Musil refers to an evening as a ripped out page, alive with all sorts of suggestions and ideas, but mummified, like everything torn from its context, full of the tyranny of that eternally fixed stance that accounts for the uncanny fascination of tableaux vivants, as though life had suddenly been given a sleeping pill and was now standing there stiff, full of inner meaning, sharply outlined, but making absolutely no sense at all. Now, in these circumstances, and I'm not saying that the circumstances are the same for every artistic practitioner. Obviously, we could extend these ideas to, modernist art practice in the visual arts. We can speak of cubism and various other aesthetic forms. We can speak of modernist fiction. We can speak of imagist poetry. I mean, for example, Ezra Pound's on a station in the metro, where there's this image, the face in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, you may remember. But let me just say that in these circumstances, when the form of epic is addressed, as it is in Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage, or in Joyce's Ulysses, or in Eliot's Wasteland, it is set against the entropy, disorder, and fragmentation of the material world. In both Pilgrimage and Ulysses, this exposure, as we may call it, to the infinite fragments of worldly experience, the entropy of the everyday, has the effect of distending the formal, distending in the sense of expanding the formal contours of epic, and deploying, in the case of Ulysses at least, the mythical method as a set of recessive parallels, a hall of mirrors in which we see Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom walking on the streets of Dublin on the 16th of June, 1904. Now, you may recall that in Ulysses, while the allusions to Homer's Odyssey are precise and insistent, 18 episodes of Joyce's novel, roughly corresponding to the 24 books of Homer's epic, Joyce deliberately disrupts the linear progression of classical epic, and there is a very strong linear flow in the Odyssey. Actually, the hero is on a journey and he's going somewhere. You may recall that the French structuralist critic Gérard Genette, asked to sum up Ulysses, said that you can reduce it to a single sentence: Odysseus reaches Ithaca. So you can say that the whole of the epic is an expansion of that sentence: Odysseus returns to Ithaca. So, but what Joyce does is to disrupt that linear progression of classical epic, substituting it with the apparently random, non-progressive, non-linear, intersecting or bifurcating trajectories of modern urban existence, as in the city of language that Wittgenstein envisaged. And I'm quoting from Wittgenstein here simply because it's one of my favorite passages in Wittgenstein, and I can't bear not to quote it. Our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods. And it's this chaotic jumble of the city that, and of language and of literature, or the literary, the texture of literary representation that Joyce is drawing upon for his novel, Ulysses. So it's a novel about language, it's a novel about the literary, and it's also a novel about the city, about the urban. And I quoted Wittgenstein because, in a sense, Wittgenstein is bringing these three elements together: the city, language, and representation. So perhaps Eliot had this crowded, chaotic, palimpsestic city in mind when he wrote The Wasteland. But the structure he chose for it, even when it was twice as long as it now is, it's now 434 lines. Let me just get that fact in here. It was from the beginning elliptic and fragmentary, rather than detailed, linear, progressive, or substantial. So it's not a matter, I mean, it is certainly not at all my argument here that Pound made it elliptic by leaving out considerable bits of it. It's not a poem that was ever written in the mode of either Ulysses or Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage, or even some of the novels, not all of them, some of the novels of Virginia Woolf. It was never written in that mode at all. It was always, I think, from the beginning, conceived in this elliptic style, where bits are deliberately left out and the whole is composed of a chaos of fragments, like a rag picker's, bag, the objects collected by Benjamin's famous rag picker in the modern city. Now, despite this, like Joyce's Ulysses, Eliot's poem is a poem that gestures repeatedly both towards epic, the genre in which classical Western civilization had imagined itself, and towards romance, the genre in which epic was reinvented after the loss and disruption suffered at the end of empire. Eliot had probably, and epic and romance, you can remember that around this time, there's a lot of scholarship which Eliot, a researcher to the end of his life, was definitely aware of, on the relation of epic to romance, on romance as a kind of medieval epic form, restructuring the epic form, on the linearity of romance as opposed to the more architectural structure of epic. So there's a great deal of work. W.P. Kerr's Epic and Romance, for example, is written around this time. So I think that Eliot has both epic and romance in mind when he's writing The Waste Land, but he is deliberately composing his work, his poem, as a collage of fragments. Eliot had probably been working on the poem from 1919 or 1920 at least. In November 1921, having suffered a nervous breakdown, Eliot and his wife Vivienne Haywood visited Ezra Pound in Paris en route to Lausanne, where he was due to receive treatment for his neurotic condition, and placed before him the manuscript of a sprawling, chaotic poem. Now, Ezra Pound, you may remember, later referred to this poem as the longest poem in the English language, which is, of course, it is not. I don't know why Pound thought it was, because it certainly wasn't the longest poem in the English language. Maybe Pound thought that it was the longest poem to employ what seemed to be a deliberately lyric or episodic style. I mean, if you count epic, then there are many longer poems in the English language. Anyway, but he left definitely a longish, sprawling, chaotic poem with Pound in Paris, and in Lausanne, where he was under treatment. He produced a 19-page version of the poem. He returned from Lausanne in January 1922, and Pound made significant editorial cuts and revisions to the manuscript that he was later to call, comparing himself to a male midwife, in the famously bawdy piece of doggerel verse that Pound wrote about the poem's birth, a Caesarean operation. So he called it a Caesarean operation. And of course, Pound wasn't alone responsible for the cuts. Eliot himself also removed and rewrote some sections. Pound thought well of the poem for all his editorial high-handedness, and he writes somewhere, after reading the manuscript, Eliot came back from his Lausanne specialist looking okay and with a damn good poem, 19 pages, in his suitcase. So it would have been about mid-January 1922 in London that The Waste Land received its final form and also its title, because again, I'm sure everyone knows this, the original title for The Waste Land was a quotation from Dickens's novel, Our Mutual Friend, he do the police in different voices. And it describes the foundling Sloppy's skills as a reader of the newspapers, where he does the various policemen speaking, imitating, different accents and different voices in crime reports. So Eliot, in fact, was a great reader, not only of Dickens and other 19th century fiction, but also of crime novels. The novel that seems, the work by Eliot that seems to be very, very close to crime fiction is, of course, Murder in the Cathedral. And there is a passage in Murder in the Cathedral that is directly imitated from a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle, a Sherlock Holmes story called The Musgrave Ritual. And it's also called, of course, Murder in the Cathedral. So you do have a great deal of, Eliot's reading, especially in contemporary popular forms, going into much of his writing. What was the state of the manuscripts that Eliot unpacked after his return from Europe? Well, I don't want to recapitulate something that is well known to us from the publication of the facsimile of the manuscripts of The Waste Land that came out when I was a university student. And I remember buying a first edition of the Faber printing of that facsimile and bringing it back to India and writing a review of it. So this is a long time ago. It was only possible to print all of that after Valerie Eliot released her claim on Eliot's manuscripts, or at least allowed the manuscripts to be printed. And so I don't want to, sort of just repeat all of that history. The Burial of the Dead had lost its Cambridge opening. A Game of Chess had its opening heavily worked over by Pound to tighten the meter. Vivian Eliot had supplied a few suggestions for improving the dialogue in the pub. The Fire Sermon had been completely cut, cut down to a much shorter form, and it needed a lot of work. Death by Water had been cut back to 10 lines. And this is the Phlebas the Phoenician section. And what the Thunder said, Pound said, was okay. Thus, the poem's center now was no longer the urban panorama refracted through a variety of parodic recapitulations, specifically Popian verse. Pound had cut all of that, saying that Pope did all of this better, and the scatology was better handled by Pound. So you might as well cut that. But rather, what confronted Eliot as he looked at this mangled manuscript of his poem was the post-war urban apocalypse that is glimpsed by Septimus Smith into The Lighthouse, the great city viewed as a desert where sparrows speak Greek and voices sing from dry wells, where the crowd flowing over London Bridge is made up of dead men, and the person one meets has planted a corpse in his garden. So Eliot must have seen the poem afresh as a different kind of journey, a journey through a wasteland where one can no longer set one's lands or one's works or words in order, rewriting, retyping, and allowing the poem to acquire its own form as a heap of broken images. He went to bed with the flu, excessively depressed. And, this is a quotation. He went to bed with the flu, excessively depressed. This is Pound in Letters. Now, what are these fragments? Most readers are aware that the fragments that Eliot shores against his ruin are literary echoes, allusions to the corpus of mainly Western literature, with an interesting departure into Vedic texts right at the end of the poem, and recalling Eliot's Harvard studies. The first section of 76 lines contains references to, various texts, the Book of Common Prayer, Chaucer, Rupert Brooke, Walt Whitman, Gautier, James Thomson, Apollinaire, Wyndham Lewis, the Bible, Donne, Tennyson, Wagner, Catullus, Joseph Campbell, Huxley, Fraser, Jessie L. Weston, Yeats, Shakespeare, Baudelaire, Dante, Pound, James Joyce, and John Webster. One allusion almost every 2 lines. One allusion almost every 2 lines. It's not my purpose really just to give you this list, because basically for 76 lines, I would have to give you about 38 allusions. It's an impossible list to compile. And some of the allusions, of course, are less prominent than others. Now, most of these allusions are to Eliot's immediate 19th and 20th century precursors, but there are older elements as well. This is, in a sense, this is a haunted poem. It's haunted both by a lost form, the form of the epic, which can no longer be recovered for the modern era, but it's also haunted by the content of the past. And this sense of a civilization that sees itself as haunted is something that you see in Freud at this time as well. Some of Freud's writings, you can see that kind of persistence through various writers writing between the wars, after the First World War and leading up to the Second. So that's a period of about 20 years. You see Western culture, Western civilization, struggling with this feeling of the ghosts of a past, both, as I said, in respect of form and in respect of content, and questions of being collapsed into, as it were, questions of nothingness. So, I mean, Jacques Derrida famously posed a link between ontology and hauntology. In English, because we pronounce the H, of course, it is easy to distinguish between ontology, the philosophy of being, and hauntology, the state of being haunted. But in French, of course, these two words are pronounced much the same. And so with his liking for wordplay, Derrida suggests that in a sense, the search for being, the search for presence is always a search, or is always a kind of being haunted by something that is not actually there. It is, in fact, a metaphysics of presence haunted by a logic of absence. But anyway, this is perhaps not immediately relevant to the wasteland, though in a sense it is also relevant. So the poem, but in a much simpler way, one can speak of the poem as being haunted. Its voices coming from history's ghosts, the snatches of a culture that the poet appears to carry in his head when, like Yeats, he lies down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And so it combines this existential crisis or existentialist crisis with pastiche and parody. Clive Bell described Eliot's poetry as largely a product of the jazz movement and saw the wasteland as part of a ragtime literature which flouts traditional rhythms and sequences and grammar and logic. And of course, there are snatches of jazz in the wasteland too. There's a reference to the Shakespearean rag. Pound actually, in many ways, casts his shadow upon the poem. He had already defined the epic as a poem including history. And if Eliot tries to include history in The Wasteland, he does so in a characteristically elliptic style. And particularly, he is addressing the problem of the loss of history. And here I do want to say something about the modernist moment, as on the one hand, looking back at history as something that presses down upon one as though an intolerable weight or burden, and also placing its trust in the tyranny of the moment, in seeing the moment as defining of its literary or aesthetic mode or modalities. And obviously, the great image here is the one chosen by Walter Benjamin in Thesis on the Philosophy of History, where he speaks of the angel of history, its face turned towards the past, while a storm blows from paradise and blows it into the future to which its back is turned. It sees all the debris of the past piled at its feet, and it can't hold, it can't stop the storm. It can't stop this wind that is blowing it into the future, but it is also seeing all the material of the past accumulating at its feet like a heap of rubbish, of garbage, of debris. And that, again, it seems to be particularly relevant to the way in which Eliot visualizes history as a kind of, as in a state of collapse or wreckage in the wasteland. Eliot, in the first draft of his own fragmentary epic, The Cantos, in 1917, Pound had written that the modern world needs such a rag bag to stuff all its thoughts in. So the modernist epic would have to be a rag bag, and the typical modernist poet would have to be something like Benjamin's rag picker or collector of useless or broken objects. So this is what I mean by, when I refer to the Wasteland, 434 lines, as an elliptic epic, because it seeks to refer to this vast canvas of world history, as well as to the immediate history, the past, which is basically the First World War, which is referred to in, very notably in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and in this poem, The Wasteland, and in Pound's poem, Hugh Selwyn Moberly. So these are poems that reflect upon the immediate, works that reflect upon the immediate past, but they also reflect upon universal history. They reflect upon the history of the world and of particularly Western civilization, and they see it as somehow completely broken and in a state of chaos or disorder, not capable of being ordered again. So perhaps the most famous of modernist rag bags is the concluding section of The Wasteland, What the Thunder Said. I mean, we can discuss, I've already talked, I think, for almost 45 minutes, so I don't want to spend too much time on, particular sections and discussing them. But I'd like to say a little bit about the notes to the poem, because in some ways, the notes to Eliot's poem are God's gift, or Eliot's gift, to the literary critic, and they enable that critic to make sense of the poem in a way that I think the poem does not actually support. In fact, the typical the way in which the poem works seems to run counter to the kind of narrative, as it were, aesthetic grammar that is imposed upon it by critical extrapolation from the notes. So let me say a little bit about the notes. One of the best known reviews of The Waste Land came out in 1922 in The Dial, where the critic Edmund Wilson said that the poem was intelligible at first reading, and that and he used Eliot's notes, as yet unpublished, to The Waste Land, to construct a kind of structure, an architectonic or even musical structure for the poem. So Wilson used unpublished notes to which he had access. Later, of course, the notes were published. And as Eliot acknowledged in The Frontiers of Criticism, his 1956 essay, in The Frontiers of Criticism, which he published in 1956, his notes have had almost greater publicity or popularity than the poem itself, and now they can never be unstuck. Now, in The Frontiers of Criticism, Eliot explains that the notes, this may or may not be true, that the notes to The Waste Land, he says, I had at first intended only to put down all the references for my quotations with a view to spiking the guns of critics of my earlier poems who had accused me of plagiarism. Actually, I wondered whether, I should describe The Waste Land as a plagiarized epic. Or a ChatGPT epic, because it's worth thinking of those possibilities, actually raised by the function of the notes. So he said that I put down the notes with a view to spiking the guns of critics of my earlier poets who had accused me of plagiarism. Then, when it came to print The Waste Land as a little book for the poem on its first appearance in The Dial and The Criterion, and you remember Edmund Wilson wrote this review on the basis of the Dial publication, had no notes whatsoever. It was discovered that the poem was inconveniently short. So I set to work to expand the notes in order to provide a few more pages of printed matter, with the result that they became the remarkable exposition of bogus scholarship that is still on view today. This is Eliot writing in The Frontiers of Criticism. Now, actually, he may have been disingenuous. It's quite likely that Eliot had the notes in mind before he began serious negotiations with his eventual publisher, Boney and Liverite, and that he had finished composing them several months before the poem first appeared in The Dial. These are the unpublished notes to which Edmund Wilson had access. So it's not really true to say that he sort of worked them up quickly in order to publish them as a book. And you remember that when he published The Waste Land as a book, there was a proposal that there should be some other poems in the book to make up those, the full page length, because this was a problem of printing. You have these formas, and the minimum forma for a published book includes some sort of pages for a quarto publication, requires some more pages which become empty if you can't fill them. And so there was a proposition that he should put some other poem in there, like The Hollow Men or Gerontion or whatever. But then he rejected those proposals because he wanted The Waste Land to stand on its own like an epic, and he put in the notes. Now, the notes have been successful in producing sort of orderly readings of the wasteland. And they do so by deflecting the cultural crisis that obviously appears in the poem into something that can be solved by an act of creative reading, or scholarly reading, actually, rather than creative, scholarly reading. So it's as though the onus of producing the poem is thrust back, as in reception theory, onto the reader. So the reader, thoroughly equipped with this with these notes, can then fill in the gaps which are there in the poem, fill in those gaps and construct this history of Western civilization. Like, Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, as though this reader is able to act conjointly with the writer as a producer of the literary work. So if you think of Roland Barthes saying that modernist literature is writerly rather than readerly. You remember that famous distinction that Roland Barthes makes between the readerly text and the writerly text. And he says that the readerly text, for example, is the 19th century novel, where you don't really have to do anything. You just sink into the novel, and the novel tells you everything, and everything is there. And if the novel doesn't tell you anything, then it doesn't exist. It's there. It has to be there. Whereas in the modernist work, everything is on the reader. The reader has to supply all that missing information. The reader has to make sense of something that doesn't otherwise make sense. So reading Kafka, reading Eliot, reading Virginia Woolf is hard work. It's hard work, and in the case of Eliot, he's giving us a crutch. Kafka doesn't give us a crutch. Virginia Woolf doesn't give us a crutch. But Eliot very thoughtfully has provided a crutch for us, and he's given us these notes through which we can make the epic not as elliptic as it first seemed, but something that is amenable to criticism and to a narrative or architectonic reconstruction, as though you were building a house out of those fragments and bits and pieces that have been produced by, I think it was Wyndham Lewis. It was William Carlos Williams who said that the wasteland wiped out our world as if an atom bomb had been dropped on it. So that wiped out world, that heap of fragments, is supposed to be reconstructed with the aid of the notes. Now, I think this is a mistake. The notes, I feel, are a bit of a red herring. They always have been, and they don't really help us to reconstruct a kind of formal, coherent whole, which would make sense only if we were infinitely read in in the kind of critical apparatus that the notes present. Jessie L. Weston's rather, trifling book, actually, From Ritual to Romance, J.G. Fraser's The Golden Bough. So all these, the story of the Fisher King, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the story of Phlebas the Phoenician, the bits out of Shakespeare, the exposure to London life, the bits in the pub, all of this. It's as though an entire cultural history, that missing cultural history, can be recomposed. And I don't think it can be. So I don't think that's the purpose of the poem, to recompose a cultural history that is given to us in fragments. But I would like to suggest at the end something slightly different and perhaps more interesting. And this brings us back to the modernist moment and to the idea of the moment as contrasted with the sweep or continuity or progression of history. Now, in modernism, modernism stakes its faith upon the power of the moment, upon the possibility of an aesthetic that captures the moment or reduces it to aesthetic form, to a kind of aesthetic intelligibility. So what survives out of a ruined world? It is the text that survives, and the wasteland, in however broken and fragmentary a form, is a text that has been put together for a reason in this way, not the reason that is supplied by the notes, but it's been put together in this fragmentary form, in this collage of bits and pieces for a reason. It survives not as a ruin, but as the sign of a world that has been ruined. And these are not my words. These are words that I've borrowed from a friend of mine, the critic Simona Sanve, from a book, a very unrelated book called The Modernity of Sanskrit. Simona says there, indeed, we could say that the very act of writing positions a text to be destined for the future towards which the angel of history's back is turned. From the moment that writing begins, and again, I'm quoting Simona here, it is placed ineluctably in flight, already moving away from the writer, away from the room and the place and the year 1922. Thus, writing in some way always speaks of a world that has ended, about the passing away of that world, not only because it is made up of words that signal the end of immediacy, or perhaps the birth of immediacy as an impossibility and as a dream, but because it comes into existence first in defiance of the moment and as a rupture in the moment, That, I think, really is, Simona is saying this in a completely different context, but it's something that I think of when I read The Wasteland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chaudhuri, for this brilliant lecture. Now the session is open for questions. Anyone can write their question in the chat box or switch on their video and audio and ask directly. Supriya, I have a question before I can begin. It's primarily an allegation, let's say. Do you think that, let's consider the archaeological nature of the poem. It's almost like a detective poem where he is giving you clues and he's giving the notes himself, taking the clues and try to understand, unravel. But do you think it also harms the, deliberately disrupts the pleasure of reading, or it's not for everyone? It's almost the point of being elitist, extremely elitist, let's say, because where you have to constantly cross-refer to something else to understand a particular line. But do you think this disruption is deliberate or also part of this modernist technique that you cannot go in a flow, you cannot involve in pleasure, do not, derive pleasure?
Right. I think that's very good, very interesting question. And yes, I agree with you. It is a disruptive technique because, when you think of it, detective fiction, which is in a way, the great modern form. I would call it a modernist form, but it is a modern form. It's really the great form of the 20th century. And all these writers, or many of them, were really addicted to reading crime thrillers and detective fiction. Of course, The Trial is also a kind of thriller or a piece of detective fiction. Who has accused him? Why is he called to trial? We don't know. At the end, the poor man is murdered. He's killed, right? Joseph K., he collapses with a knife in his back. But who has done this? Who has done this to him? Right through all this business at the law courts, we want to know who is the person who is responsible for this accusation? Why is he up there on trial? We are not told. Again, in the wasteland, you're quite right. There are so many clues, and all of these clues, because they cross each other, because they serve a disruptive rather than an elucidatory function. Instead of a Sherlock Holmes coming here and saying, elementary, my dear Watson, you can, leave out all these other explanations which won't work, and you pick on this one, which is the correct one. And once we've done that, we have a perfectly logical solution. So the text that I referred to in Murder in the Cathedral. Now, in Murder in the Cathedral, you have the Musgrave ritual being referred to. In the Conan Doyle story, detective story, where actually taking place in the house of Reginald Musgrave, where Sherlock Holmes and Watson go in order to help this friend of Holmes's from his college days to make sense of a kind of ritual that he is asked to undertake. The eldest son of the house has to undertake this ritual when he comes into his maturity, when he becomes an adult. And the terms of the ritual is that certain questions are asked and answers are given. Whose is it? He who will come. For whom do we have it? Whose was it? He who is gone. For whom do we hold it? And then the end last is, why do we keep it for the kingdom that will come? Something like this. Anyway, it turns out, and through Holmes's elucidation, that the reference is to the lost crown of Charles I. The crown of Charles I. And this crown is held by the members of the Musgrave family, who were a Catholic family, a recusant family, during the civil wars. And this lost crown is the treasure that is being held in the Musgrave house. So once you work that out, once you've decoded the ritual, then the references are exact. They are to the past king, the present king, the future king, etc. But Eliot makes it into a kind of Christian open-ended questioning. For whom do we have it, or whose is it? For the power and the glory. Remember that phrase, the power and the glory, comes from Murder in the Cathedral. Graham Greene picks it up then and uses it in a novel. Right. So anyway, so what Eliot is doing is to take a text which is entirely based on the logic of disclosure, progressive disclosure through the unraveling of clues, works it into something that is incredibly obscure and is founded upon the mystery of the sacrament, the mystery of the Christian Eucharist and the sacrament and so on. So too in the wasteland, you have these references, but it's not as though by getting hold of one set of references, you will be able to say what this entire poem is about. The Fisher King doesn't help you once you're with the Vedanta, That is not where the Fisher King is going to give you any elucidation. So that's, I think your point is a very good one. And I think that basically you might say that a lot of modernist fiction is riffing on detective fiction and turning it inside out by saying that its answers don't work.
And to extend my point, if you read them, they come to us as very Marxist. They're about the downtrodden, the wasted, and yet it's not accessible to the public. You don't find people reading the wasteland except people from literature. I don't know how to solve this dilemma ever. Can you throw some light on it?
It's the dilemma of modernist literature, isn't it?
Yeah, somewhat. Yes.
Yeah. So sorry, I couldn't get who was speaking. Was it you speaking, Ushiji?
Oh, I was speaking.
Yeah. Really, this is the dilemma of modernist literature, that it is about about the rag pickers and the dwellers in wastelands, and yet it is not accessible to them because there is a kind of inherent elitism in modernist literature. That, I would say, is less so in the case of Latin American modernism, African modernism, Asian or Indian modernism. There is a great deal more accessibility, I would suggest, in the nature of that literary, performance.
Right.
I would say that while it's obviously true that not everybody is reading Shakti Chattopadhyay, or not everybody is sort of reading Shubimal Misra, and God rest his soul, but the point is that there is more of an interaction with the world of work and of labor than there is in Eliot, definitely. Labor, particularly.
Right. Supriya, there are 3 questions. Would you read them, or do I read them out?
Sorry. So just a minute.
In the chat section.
I'll take a look. Yeah. So there's Rishabh Deb Roy.
Right.
Is that the one? Sorry.
Yes. Yes. There's 3 questions.
I can't see the other ones. Can you tell me? I can only see Rishabh Deb Roy.
And then if you scroll down, there's only the Shen.
I have scrolled down.
Okay.
No,
okay, maybe I'll read.
Could you just read them out, please?
Okay, sure. Do you address the first one? Would you address the first one? Do you read it out?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So which one is that?
Yes, Rishabh Deb Roy.
Well, that one I can see. Yes.
Okay.
The Ubi Sunt motif. Yes, I think so. Right. Yeah. Yes, definitely. Where, I think that this Ubi Sunt motif in Christianity, in Christian works, is really about past glory that is lost. I'm not sure that Eliot thinks of the past as glorious anymore. There is a kind of a sense of waste and of ruin, but I'm not sure that he's thinking of the past as having a totality at any point. Because, I mean, the Ubi Sunt the Ubi Sunt motif is related to Gloria Mundi, the glories of the world. Yeah. Right. Thank you.
Yes. The next question is by Onita Sengupta. She's writing, if you could throw some light on the sexual politics in the poem, both contemporary and mythical.
Right. Sexual politics. Well, look, this is such a large question. I don't particularly want to take it up. There's a lot of sexual politics that was excised by Pound. Pound, there's a lot more sex in the poem, and rather vulgar references to women in a way that I think, well, I don't know whether Pound found it distasteful, but certainly I find it distasteful when I read the earlier drafts of The Wasteland, and to a considerable extent that material is reduced in the final form of The Wasteland. In the poem, there is a sense of women as sort of as commodities, but also of their own approach to that work of to that world of work and labor as laboring subjects, as laboring agents. And that, I think, is an interesting feature where women's work, women's labor is seen in the poem and understood to be something that women are themselves conscious of and knowledgeable about. I mean, that they are, while they are obviously part of that detritus of the wasteland which they, in which they are seen, they are at the same time consumers and users of the everyday. And that, I think, is a point that needs to be understood.
Right. The third question.
And there's also, of course, that Tiresias image, the sort of this androgynous old man, I, Tiresias, have suffered all. That idea of androgyny, which Virginia Woolf was also very drawn to, is an important feature of the modernist thought experiment, as it were. So that modernist thought experiment is something that seems to be struggling to understand the varieties of sexual experience, as it were, through an androgynous figure.
Right. Anushka Nandi asks, what is the relevance of the text today? I mean, because it was written about a particular context, it's a very age-specific poem. How do we understand the common man's predicament vis-a-vis the poem? In fact, why are we reading the text today? Why are we discussing it today?
I don't know how to answer a question like that. Why do you read literature? Why do you read, Shakespeare or Kalidasa or Rabindranath Tagore? All of them wrote very long ago. Many of them, you read many texts from different periods in the past for different reasons. The Wasteland is an extraordinary poem. It's a monument to its age and its shattered civilization. But it's a poem also that has, I think, profound relevance to our own sense of chaos and disorder, to our own experience of living in a world that is in pieces, all coherence gone. And that's a line from John Donne, a world in pieces, all coherence gone. It's something that John Donne said in the 16th century. Why do you read it? Why, well, don't read it, Watch Pathan if you don't want to read it. But what does it matter? The Wasteland is one of those poems that people, at least in my generation, have by heart. I can recite 434 lines of the Wasteland. It's extraordinary. Eliot is so quotable. At one time, you could sort of track the progress of newspaper pieces, editorials, popular prose through quotations from Eliot and Yeats. So something would be The Hollow Men, something would be The Center Cannot Hold, something else would be Things Fall Apart, something would be, and Eliot himself would say from Conrad, the horror. So, I mean, it's all, like Walter Benjamin said, of intensely citable text. Citable, its citability is, I think it's primary, the hold that it has on our imaginations today. I mean, it's as though you can cite it in any context. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. That's again a quotation from another text, but it's something that appears in the Wasteland.
Right. Onindo Sen asks, he's a teacher himself. He says, I try every single...
I know Onindo.
Yeah, because I try every single year for the last 5 or 6 years to teach the Wasteland to an MA class, and I wonder if there is any point. The text seems impossible to control in a PG classroom. Murder in the Cathedral is better, more accessible, more enjoyable even, but Wasteland, should we reconsider having it in the syllabus? What do you think? He asked.
Oh, I don't know about the syllabus. I do think people should read The Wasteland. Whether they need to have it in the syllabus, that is, honestly, after having finished my, formal teaching in the classroom in 2013, that is 10 years ago, I'm absolutely so delighted not to have anything to do with the syllabus and the curriculum. I don't know whether anything should be formally text in the syllabus. People should read it. And if they want to write on it, they should. And if they don't want to write on it, they don't need to. I think that people should be given a selection of texts and say, read anything. You can write on whichever takes your fancy. So if they don't like it, they can write on something else.
Right. And the last question we have is, does T.S. Eliot challenge his own idea of theory of impersonality in the wasteland?
Well, I think that this, again, is this theory of impersonality, the escape, the escape from personality, the escape from emotions, but only those who have personality and emotions know what it is to want to escape from these things. That's what he says. Now, this is, in a way, Eliot himself is challenging the lyric mode, which was the apart from the novel. I mean, there are two major aesthetic modes that are adopted in the 19th century. One is the novel, which appears to be, in a sense, third person. While, of course, there are some novels that are written in the first person. Basically, it's a kind of third person structure. Something that is describing the world out there and describing various characters and their experiences. So it's full of representational detail. And the other major mode of the 19th century is lyric poetry. And lyric poetry is very first person. It's sort of full of this first person reference. It's about me, myself. It's about Wordsworth saying what happened to him. 5 years are past, 5 summers, etc. And again, I stand, he says, in front of this view. I see it again. And he's talking about himself, his personal experiences. His life seems to him like an epic. It's an epic of a personal journey, the prelude. So you have these two major modes. And you find that in modernism, there's a kind of escape from both. There's an escape from the descriptive and narrative logic of the novel. And there's an attempt to escape, not so successful actually, from the lyric mode, which places, which requires enormous resources of subjectivity. That is to say, the lyric poet is compelled to think of herself as a fully formed subject from which lyric poetry issues as its expression. Now, in modernist poetry, there's a survival of that lyric power because, it's very difficult to escape the person, to escape the subject. But Eliot is trying to tell us that no, we are not actually just expressing ourselves in poetry. We are trying to escape from what life is, what our subjecthood, what our personhood is. We are trying to bring out something else in poetry. I mean, we are the text, the textual, the universe of text is different from the universe of subjectivity and the self. So you have people in modernist poetry having basically nervous breakdowns. So you have Eliot, you have Sylvia Plath, you have various other writers who, in a sense, are producing a kind of neurasthenics view of the everyday, not from the perspective of a unified and collected subject, which has the resources to speak and to express itself, but rather, like Christina Rossetti saying, my heart is like a singing bird, and, I will today sort of sing whatever. Instead of that, it's basically like the person, my nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Why do you never speak? Speak. So there's a person there, but they're not, as it were, able to speak. And there's something else that is being said, which is not necessarily that person's emotion or that person's feelings, as though through the nerves in patterns on a screen, something like that.
Right. So here ends our session. Thank you so much, Professor Chaudhuri, for your intriguing reflections on the epic like nature and history of the wasteland. And this was an absolutely brilliant session. Might I add how fortunate we all are just to be here listening to you. And I hope we will have such sessions with you again in the near future. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for being so patient and cooperative.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you to everyone. I'm sorry, I don't think I took all your questions. There were some new messages and new questions, but I really, I think that people will have to work out their wasteland for themselves. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye then.
Bye.
Thank you.